recently read a piece of research that suggested that group training programmes just don't work, that they're ineffective and fail to deliver on the objectives that they were designed to fulfil. Now, you can imagine for me, because that's what I do, that was quite disappointing research to read, because my experience is that group training is actually a great experience for people and usually does deliver on exactly what it was designed to achieve. So it got me thinking about the differences and why some training programs might not work when others do. And to be honest with you, most of what I came up with is nothing to do with what the trainers are doing and very little to do with the content of the workshop. It's actually all to do with the way it's set up. So here are some of the things that I can remember going wrong in my early career, things that I've since fixed, and perhaps I take it for granted that other people would do that too, but maybe in today's busy world these things don't always happen. So here are some reasons why your group training programme might not be working. First of all, sometimes the participants are just not very enthusiastic about being on the programme, being involved in workshops, or indeed learning something new. And that usually isn't because they are negative and cynical and disengaged. It's usually because nobody's actually sat down with them and explained, what is this training programme about? What is it designed to do? Why have you been invited to come on it? What can you expect to get out of it? And without that, it's not surprising, really, that people sometimes turn up on day one thinking, it's better things I could be doing with my day. There probably are. So that's one area, is have the participants actually been prepared properly to participate in the programme? The next thing is that sometimes people are given pre-course work to do that, for whatever reason, they just don't manage to do. And therefore they're at a disadvantage when the workshop starts because they haven't prepared in the way that the trainer intended them to do. That's one of the reasons why we often don't do pre-course work, because sometimes it's easier just to say to people, clear the dates in your diary and show up. That's all you need to do. When people are very busy, that can be a bit of a relief not to have to do a lot of preparation. But of course, if you do pre-course work, then that can cut down the amount of time that people actually have to be out of their normal routine. So, there are kind of pros and cons on both sides, and it's really all about figuring out what's going to work with an individual programme. The other area where I think sometimes group training doesn't work is where the participants arrive at the workshop and they're not in a good state for learning. And this can be for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it is because they haven't done the pre-course work and they're feeling a bit guilty about it. Sometimes it's because they're worried about what's going to happen to their normal work in their absence. And if their line manager has not spent time with them working out how is their work going to be covered, that can be a really serious consideration and can be a big distraction. One that I quite often come across is that sometimes people have been up really early, sometimes, 4 a.m, in order to catch a flight and arrive at the place where the training is being held. And however much I say to people, please come the night before, there are always people who have good reasons why it's better to get up at 4 a.m. But I can tell you that by lunchtime, it's never better to have been up at 4 a.m. unless that's something that you would do every day normally. So that's some of the reasons why people are not in a good state for learning. Either they're feeling guilty or they're worried about something or they're just exhausted. Then we go into what actually happens during the workshop. Sometimes people get distracted and they find it hard to concentrate and therefore they're not taking in the information that's being given to them. And there are not lots of reasons why they might be distracted. Some of them are very simple to fix. One reason in a big group could be that they just don't know everybody. And so they're wondering who all these people are and what they do and, is it worth getting to know them? And not every group has the opportunity to spend time getting everybody introduced and finding out who does what and why they're here and so on. And that can be a big distraction for somebody who has a need to connect. Other reasons could be that if there are more senior people in the room, then the need to cultivate somebody's good opinion might hold somebody back from fully participating in what's going on in the room. Sometimes you get so-called observers coming in from L&D or HR and they sit at the back taking notes. That can be a huge distraction because the participants are thinking, well, what are they taking notes about? What are they paying attention to? And probably they're not actually making any notes about individual participants, but the thought is there and that can be a big distraction. And of course, other things that can be distracting is that concern about what's going on while they're not in their normal work. Is there email coming in? Are there telephone calls that they've missed? So those sorts of things can also be exacerbated if somebody's taking every opportunity in the tea breaks to go and check up with what's going on back at the office. All big distractions. And that's before we even get into things like the environment being uncomfortable, or the chair's too hard, or the air conditioning's noisy, or all those sorts of other things that can be a big distraction. I think the final area that I think is often a distraction for people, unless it's properly handled, is the concern about confidentiality. Often, the kind of work that we do, we're getting people to think about some of the real nitty-gritty about how they do their job and what effect they have on other people, who they influence, who they don't influence, and so on. And sometimes it's hard to discuss those sorts of things if somebody's worried that what they say might be used against them in another context. So it's very important to set up all the confidentiality beforehand. Then the other area where the report that I read was pointing fingers was saying that people didn't implement what they learned on a course. So they might at the end of a day or 2 days or even longer say, yes, this has been interesting, it's been relevant, I've learned a lot. But did that actually translate into anything changing when they went back into the workplace? And often it doesn't. And there are many reasons for this, but the principal one is just that people are so busy that they go back to work, they've got a backlog of 2 or 3 days, or even just 1 day, because nobody made adequate provision for them not being there. And suddenly they're just overwhelmed with the need to work on the things that happened while they weren't there. So that gets in the way of stepping back and saying, right, how can I do something different in the light of what I learned? I also think that there's a lot of peer pressure here, that if nobody else is doing anything different, then it can be difficult to be the first person to try a new way of doing something. And there's always that concern that if you do start doing something different, other people will look at you and say, you've been on a course, have you? Which isn't really what we want to be on the receiving end of. My final point about the reasons why training programs sometimes don't work is that often it is just that we don't have a decent way of measuring the impact of the training. Especially when you're talking about interpersonal skills, leadership skills, all the things that are kind of intangible, that don't readily come down to numbers. It can be very hard to demonstrate that somebody has improved their leadership capability if you didn't really have any great measures of how good it was in the first place. And sometimes I think it's easy to conclude that your training hasn't made a difference because it's difficult to measure it. Sometimes when you do measure things, when you get people to self-assess and you say, OK, rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 as to how good you are on this, and the person picks a number. And you think, right, OK, we'll do the same thing again at the end and rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 now. Sometimes that number goes down. And it isn't because they've got worse. It's because now they've actually got a better idea of what it is that's expected from them, and they've realised that they're not as good as they thought they were. So that's the first step, I suppose, in going from the unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. But it doesn't necessarily look good when you're wanting to demonstrate that your training has made a difference. So these are all the reasons why group training programs sometimes don't achieve what they're intended to achieve. And it's nothing to do with the content of the program or the way the trainer delivers it. It's all to do with how it's set up. Of course, if you want to know more about how all this works, do get in touch with me. There's a lot more I could say on this subject.